Welcome to the Ram Dass book reading with Polishing the Mirror with Rameshwar. I'm Jackie Dobrinska. I'm the Education and Community Outreach Director for the Love, Serve, Remember Foundation, and I'm super excited to be with you all today as we continue to explore these ways to build and deepen connections within the Ram Dass satsang. Community, one of the reasons I love this is because community is so important. Meister Eckhart says, community is where our great gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Or in other words, it's where we come together to feed each other. And everyone is hungry for something and everyone has something to give. And we live in this mysterious time. The future is always unknown, but now we're so acutely aware of it. And it's during these times when we need to deepen into teachings that sustain us and nourish us and enliven us. And so how do we do that? We read books, we listen to podcasts, and we show up to these live stream events. And we learn how to connect to each other, even if it's only virtually. And so we're utilizing these platforms to find ways to connect and learn together. So today we're reading from Polishing the Mirror. Ramesh will read for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a live Q&A after. And how you ask your questions is just type in the chat function of whatever platform you're on right now. And then we'll bring those and get to answer those. The Ram Dass Foundation and the Love Serve Remember, or the Fellowship, the Ram Dass Fellowship and the Love Serve Remember Foundation, we're offering lots of ways to connect right now. So the foundation has put together a compassion and practice and action bundle that's on the ramdass.org website. Really encourage you to check it out. On June 1st, the fellowship is hosting a book club. So it's a follow-up to today's reading where we'll actually meet face-to-face and have breakout rooms and have a deeper discussion. So if you want to sign up and be a part of that, sign up for the fellowship at ramdass.org/fellowship. On the 2nd, we're going to be launching an online Hanuman Chalisa workshop where we'll take 22 days to learn this chant together. And then in early June, we're also going to be offering another online live stream event with Mir by Bush. But one of the best ways to really deepen into community and into satsang is through local fellowship. And a lot of them are meeting virtually right now. So if you want to find a local fellowship in your area so that you can connect more face-to-face, again, make sure you sign up with the fellowship, so ramdass.org fellowship, or you can also just email me, Jacqueline at ramdass.org, or info@ramdass.org. It's a little easier than spelling my name. So I want to take a moment just to honor all of the amazing people that work to make these live stream happen. Mangala and JR and Kelly and Rachel and Tanya, and then of course Rameshwar Das for being here. So because we keep offering these things, I really invite you to consider making a contribution to the Love, Serve, Remember Foundation so that we can continue to curate the Ram Dass Library, host online events, and just remain the solid organization that carries this legacy into the future. So if you'd like to contribute, you can go to ramdass.org/support. So now I invite you to sort of settle into your space to, on all of these screens, it can easy to be distracted and sort of get into the square of the computer. So just take a moment to sort of pull back into yourself and recognize there's hundreds of people here connected today. Feel your feet for a second. Feel your breath in your body, in your heart, and in your belly. And tune into that loving awareness that you are. We'll just take a few deep breaths together. Nice. So now it's my honor to introduce Rameshwar Das. He met Ram Dass in 1967, soon after his return from India. He spent time with Maharaji in India from 1970 to 1972, and over the years, he's collaborated on several projects with Ram Dass, including the original collection of manuscripts that became Be Here Now, the Love, Serve, Remember box set of recordings, and he's also co-author of more recent books like Be Love Now and Polishing the Mirror, which is what we're reading today. It's an essential guide to cultivating practices that are central to shifting our moment-to-moment experience of suffering. So with that, I will turn it over and we can hear some of these amazing teachings.
Did that work?
There it is. Yes. Welcome.
You're sitting in front of the Himalayas, so you don't have to see the clutter in my office.
It's lovely.
So polishing the mirror is kind of it's a compilation of Ram Dass teachings from over the years. And the title comes from the beginning of the Hanuman Chalisa. And I'm going to read that. It's just from the opening page of just after the dedication of the book. Taking the pollen-like dust of my guru's lotus feet to polish the mirror of my heart, I can now sing the pure splendor of Sri Ram, the best of ragus, which bestows the four fruits of life. I don't know anything so and remove my impurities and sorrows. Those are the polite words for all of the impurities that we all carry around. And that comes through grace. So I'm going to read from the 6th chapter of this, which is called From Suffering to Grace, which seems like what we all need some of at this juncture in our planetary spin together. From suffering to grace, there are times when each of us has to bear the unbearable. It may come as physical pain, illness, or emotional suffering of our own, of someone dear to us, or of other sentient beings. Can you respond to suffering without closing down and still keep your heart open? It seems almost instinctive to use your mind to protect your heart, to rationalize the suffering, to avoid the pain or discomfort. But then you cut yourself off from true compassion for yourself and others. Most of us armor our hearts when dealing with the immensity of the suffering that exists in the world. We look at all the people who are starving when we've just finished a big breakfast and we turn away. We feel like there's nothing we can do and we can't bear to see the suffering. Armoring the heart is the opposite of opening the heart. You know the feeling of loving another person. You know how that love feeds you. Love is how we feed each other, but when you experience overwhelming suffering, you close your heart defensively. Your heart may feel protected and less vulnerable, but it's also deadened in the process. Armoring the heart cuts off the living spiritual interchange of energy that exists in the universe and that nourishes the spirit in all of us. We all fear suffering. People find the world scary because they become overwhelmed by the suffering around them, their own and everybody else's. In any major city in the United States, there are homeless people sleeping in doorways. It's one thing to experience this in India. In Calcutta, it seems like half the population lives in the street. But in the affluent United States, it's bizarre that some people live so well and some are so poor. It feels like we should be able to get it together enough to provide everybody with at least shelter, food, and clothing. We probably add in healthcare at this point. Are we turning away because our minds are closing off our hearts to the suffering of others? I deal with the immensity of the suffering all around me by cultivating more than one plane of consciousness, by witnessing, and by acknowledging the laws of the universe. When I can arrive at a perceptual vantage point where I look at a leaf or a drop of water or stars and planets and see the oneness of existence, I can begin to see the exquisite interrelationship of phenomena. I can find universal law in each field I examine: physics, astronomy, music, genetics, mathematics, chemistry. From that point of view of oneness, I can't help being filled with awe at the magnificence of how it all works. I also realize that suffering is part of the way it all works. Why is there suffering? After the Buddha's enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, he expounded to his new disciples what came to be known as the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth says that all existence is characterized by suffering. Birth is suffering, death is suffering, old age has in it suffering, and sickness has in it suffering. Not getting what you want has in it suffering, and getting what you don't want has in it suffering. Even getting what you do want or not getting what you don't want involves suffering, because both are in time. Anything in time is impermanent. Jesus said, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt." As long as you're caught up in time, there's suffering. The second and third noble truths deal with the causes of suffering, which are the clinging of mind to attractions and aversions and to a false sense of self. And the fourth noble truth lays out the eightfold path to get free of suffering. The way of grace. I deeply honor the Buddha, and I have studied Buddhism a lot and practiced much Buddhist meditation. But my particular spiritual path is through my guru, Maharaji. The guru reflects our deepest self. Indeed, when fully known, the guru is our deepest self, and that is who we see when we polish the mirror of our being. My relationship with Maharaji is one of faith. That faith allows me to see everything that comes my way as his grace. Just remembering that everything is his grace is itself grace, but sometimes it doesn't come easy. On February 19th, 1997, I suffered a severe hemorrhagic stroke, a bleed rather than a blockage. I had been working on a book about aging, and I was lying in bed trying to imagine what it would be like to be old and sick and suffering when I had a massive stroke. The phone rang. I tried to get out of bed to answer it, and I fell onto the floor. I was paralyzed on one side. I managed to reach the phone and pick up the receiver, but I was unable to speak. My friend calling from New Mexico realized something was wrong and asked me to tap on the phone if I needed help, which I did. Within a few minutes, my secretaries, Marlene and Joanne, appeared, soon followed by paramedics. I remember being wheeled into the hospital on a gurney. During those first few days, no one knew if I would survive. The news of my stroke traveled fast, even to India. Prayer circles around the country were sending me healing energy. The people surrounding me The doctors and nurses, my friends and relatives, all wore long faces. They kept saying, "Oh, you poor guy, you've had a stroke." As I absorbed their mindsets, I started to think I was a poor guy, just another stroke victim. They were projecting the full view of a stroke as a medical disaster onto me. It was coming from almost everybody except the cleaning woman. Whenever she came into my room, she was totally present with me. She knew. Before my stroke, I felt like I led a life of grace because I was under the protective umbrella of my guru. The stroke shattered my faith in that protection. I felt I had fallen out of grace. I lost faith and I got very depressed for a while. I'd look at the picture of my guru on the hospital wall and say, "Where were you when I had this stroke? Were you out to lunch?" For the first 2 months, I was totally dependent and suffering, physically, psychologically, and spiritually. I sat in my hospital bed attempting to make sense of what had happened. On one hand, there was the stroke, and on the other hand, there was Maharaji's grace. How did this stroke fit in with his grace? Slowly, things began to shift. I started thinking about the stroke in different ways. Could this stroke be grace in any way? Awful grace? It certainly wasn't helping my ego, but how could it possibly benefit my soul? The effects of the stroke included aphasia, paralysis, and dependence on others. Attempting to re-perceive it, I tried to find out where the grace might be hidden. After all, this was still Maharaji's play, his Leela. I was trying to figure out Maharaji's grace in the stroke, how this sickness was going to help me get to God. Early on, I was markedly aphasic, unable to speak at all. Learning to speak again was hard. Words came slowly. I had to learn to deal with silence, a great boon spiritually, because it forced my mind to be quiet. I had to go beyond my intellect into the silence of my intuitive heart. As I became more absorbed in the heart, I found it to be a place where separation disappears and knowledge gives way to wisdom. About a year and a half after my stroke, I started speaking again publicly. It's good motivation for your speech therapy to have 500 people waiting for you to get your words out. When I would lecture before the stroke, there'd always be one or two people in the audience who had been dragged to hear me speak by a spouse or a friend. It was easy to pick them out of the crowd. They'd be sitting with their arms folded and their faces wearing a long, suffering look. I'd work hard to help them open their hearts. Now my wheelchair opened their hearts. And because of the wheelchair, I was always assured of having a seat wherever I went. The stroke taught me about dependency. I went from being the driver of a sports car to a passenger. I was in a body that now needed help from others. As a passenger, I could appreciate the passing trees and clouds in a way I couldn't when I had to pay attention to traffic. I had written a book called How Can I Help with Paul Gorman. Now I needed to write one called How Can You Help Me? Since the stroke, I've been deeply humbled by the compassion of other beings. I'm blessed to have such wonderful people taking care of me. Now they take care of my body, and together we take care of each other's souls. Changing your point of view. As I see it, we have 3 vantage points or planes of consciousness from which we live. The first is the ego, the plane of personality. The second is our individual soul, part of which is the witness consciousness we talked about. The third is the mystic part of us. Quakers call it the still small voice within, or the inner light. Hindus call it the Atman. We can think of it as the one. Each of us has all three of these channels. They're all here simultaneously, but how you experience reality depends on which one your awareness is tuned to. When you dwell deep in the intuitive self, you're on the soul plane. If you follow that awareness and go in, you will come to God awareness, to the Atman. That same awareness is in you and in me. God consciousness is the same in all of us. While we think we're our incarnation, our soul witnesses it all and ultimately connects us to the universal God consciousness that dwells within each of us. These days, I see myself as a soul who has taken incarnation in a body that suffered a stroke. So while my ego thought I was a person with a stroke, that suffering pushed me into my soul, which witnesses or watches the incarnation. It's much less painful to watch the stroke than to have the stroke. I have pains throughout my body. I list them for my doctors, but I don't identify with them. I identify with being a witness of pain. Physical pain is in the body, and I am not my body. My body is out there, and I am in here. Pain is part of the body. Now, if we're talking about psychological pain, that is from the ego, which is also out there. I remember I am my consciousness, my awareness. I am inside, and I live with the pain, not as the pain, but with the pain. There's another way the stroke proved beneficial. It pushed me into my soul. Instead of leaving me wallowing in the physical problems of my incarnation, it gave me a leg up and took me into my soulness. Is it suffering or is it grace? Recall the story from the Ramayana in which Ravana, the demon king, kidnaps Sita, the earth mother or the soul, who is married to God, Ram. He carries her away to the demon capital on the island of Sri Lanka. As the army of monkeys and bears arrives at the ocean shore in India looking for Sita, Jambavan, the king of the bears, reminds Hanuman that he has divine powers. Then Hanuman takes his great leap of faith and flies over the ocean to find Sita. As I struggled in my mind to accept this stroke, a message came from a dear friend in India. In the same way that Hanuman needed to be reminded of his powers, my friend KK in India felt I should be reminded of the power of my faith. KK wrote some simple words that Maharaji had said to him about me. I will do something for him. Just that remembrance was enough to recall my faith. My soul was once again enveloped in Maharaji's blanket of love. Siddhima, the mother in India, who maintains Maharaji's ashrams, saw Mickey Lemley's documentary film about me and the stroke, which was called Fierce Grace. In the film, I talked about trying to see the stroke as Maharaji's grace. She sent me a message that Maharaji would never give me a stroke. I finally realized that the stroke was the natural result of my own karma. Maharaji's grace lay in helping me deal with the effects of the stroke. It's true that being able to deal with the suffering from the stroke changed my life. I certainly wouldn't wish a stroke on anyone, but mine has had its positive side. Although I lost my faith for a while, over time, it has been tempered and deepened. Although for a time I was overwhelmed by the suffering, eventually I found a place in myself that has faith that this stroke is part of my awakening, and that was the grace. Living with both the perfection and the pain of the suffering allows me to stay with the pain without pushing it away, because I have that balance within myself. I'm part of the unfolding of it all, and that includes suffering. When my stepmother Phyllis was dying, the pain she went through forced her to give up clinging to her body and led to her spiritual awakening during the few days before she died. I wouldn't have given her that pain, but who am I to judge? As a human being with an emotional heart, I am faced with the paradox that I want to relieve suffering, while at the same time, there's another part of me that understands that sometimes there is grace in suffering. From a spiritual point of view, suffering is sometimes the sandpaper that awakens people. Once you start to awaken spiritually, you reperceive your own suffering and start to work with it as a vehicle for further awakening. When you suffer, the suffering seems to envelop your world. Think of a framed picture of a cloud. If the picture is cropped too closely, you see only the gray of the cloud. If the picture is cropped to a wider angle, you see the blue sky all around it. That's grace. How are we doing time-wise here, Jackie? Do you want me to stop reading or should I finish the chapter?
We're about 30 minutes. Ooh.
All right, I'm going to read one more section about faith, but I don't think I'll read the whole chapter. The whole game is based on faith. Faith comes through grace. In the Bible, the Apostle Paul says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves. It's not something you did. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." When the faith is strong enough, it is sufficient just to be. Without faith, the existential fears and uncertainties that we all have dominate. If you have faith, you have no fear. If you don't have faith, you fear. As I questioned my own faith after the stroke, I began to ask, faith in what? I found that my faith is in the One. Not faith in Maharaji as a person, but faith in him as a doorway to the One. Faith in the One in Maharaji. Oneness is a state of being. Again, this is the state where, as the great South Indian saint Ramana Maharshi said, God, Guru, and self are the same, are one. Maharaji simply held up one finger and said, Sub Ek, it's all one. Faith is the reflection of that oneness in the mirror of your soul. Faith is the way you connect to that universal truth of oneness. Faith and love are intimately entwined. As it says in the Ramayana, without devotion, there is no faith. Without faith, there is no devotion. Faith is not a belief. Beliefs are in the head. Faith is in the heart. Faith comes from within you. You cultivate it by opening your spiritual heart and quieting your mind until you feel your identity with your deeper self. That opening to the deeper self, when you've quieted your mind, comes through grace. The qualities of that self are peace, joy, compassion, wisdom, and love. Okay, let's stop there.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right.
Are you getting anything on the chat block? Is there anybody out there?
Can you hear me?
Can other people hear you?
I believe so. So Shannon Beatty asks, if the next Buddha is satsang, who will help ensure the message being delivered is accurate and does not lose its loving integrity? If the answer is me, my heart is open to learn from who will teach.
I mean, who are the next teachers, I guess, huh? If it's all us. I don't know. I mean, when Ram Dass is talking about that shared consciousness, that if we can find that place in ourselves where we are the same, and that is a matter of getting out of our, desires and aversions and all our thought processes about who we think we are. Ram Dass always repeated, you are not who you think you are. You're not your thinking mind. So beneath that, or around that thinking mind, is our shared awareness. If we can dwell in that awareness, then we're in a shared consciousness, because awareness is the same in all of us. And in that sense, we can tune into each other's needs, and probably, I don't know about teaching and teachers. There are teachers and there are teachings. And sometimes you don't know which one you're getting in the moment. And I think that has to do with the how free or attached we may be as beings for each other. We don't always have clarity, or we're not always free of our views. It's a great little booklet that Ram Dass used to read from, and recorded on that Love, Serve, Remember album in, what was that, 1973. I'm turning into the institutional memory. And my memory is very holy. It's full of holes. Okay, this is from the third Chinese patriarch of Zen. It's called the Sin Sin Ming, which translates as Verses on the Faith Mind. And this is just the opening few lines. The great way is not difficult for those not attached to preferences. When neither love nor hate arises, all is clear and undisguised. Separate by the smallest amount, however, and you are as far from it as heaven is from earth. If you wish to know the truth, then hold to no opinions for or against anything, to set up what you like against what you dislike, is the disease of the mind. So finding the place where we can be teachers, really true satsang together. Satsang, I think the direct translation is something like the community of seekers after truth. And in that sense, when we actually become that for each other, then we are each other's teachers, or we tune into that place where we are one. And I think that's probably the closest we can come to what the Buddha was talking about.
Thank you. So Ryan Sanders asks, do you have any useful tips on recognizing the silver lining in suffering as it is happening?
Ouch. Well, what Ram Dass is talking about in terms of the witness, I think is however you find to get into that place. I used to think of the witness as sort of the same place I would get into when I was doing Vipassana meditation, or something that's sort of neutral observer place. And I asked Ram Dass about it at one point, and he said, no, it's part of the soul. It's really, it's part of your spiritual being. It's really part of your spiritual heart rather than a mind place. So whatever way that you have, whether it's mantra or watching your breath or thinking of your beloved, however that works for you, if you can find even a moment in between breaths or screams or whatever is, tearing at you in that moment. And it's pretty situational, I'm sure, for each of us, of how we deal with stuff. But the tendency is to climb into our own suffering and the suffering of the people around us. And that usually gets everybody in deeper. And sometimes it seems like an abrupt or a non-compassionate response. Sometimes the most helpful response is to try to break free of that attachment just for a moment, so you can see it, so you can let it be. And when you can let things be, is that verse from the Chinese patriarch says, then it becomes clearer. All becomes clear and undisguised. And then I think you begin to just see conditions. And ultimately, even the worst suffering and even our life and death are conditions arising and dissolving. But being with that is, with an open heart, is not easy. And Ram Dass used to talk about loving it, loving your own suffering, and that can be a way through. Is that helpful?
Yes. It was what you just spoke of. I was listening to the Compassion and Action bundle, and hearing those words of the having compassion for those places in us and having that be part of the practice. I've been finding very useful. James writes, we all know Ram Dass's difficulties with the stroke. What were your difficulties as a friend to Ram Dass in dealing with his stroke and the changes that it brought on?
Well, it was like going through a really incredible journey with uh, a deep friend, and having to acknowledge that it was a pretty rough road, and at the same time were still um, hanging out. Uh, and It's hard to see somebody you love suffer. Anybody that you love. Um, and it was interesting to see how he worked with it over time, because he was, he was in his body for 20 odd years after the stroke, in the wheelchair. Couldn't talk at first. Worked really hard at getting his speech back. He had speech therapists and physical therapists. He had acupuncturists. I mean, his life went from being a kind of a normal life where he was able to just do whatever he wanted to being completely dependent on other people. And I saw the way that he worked with that, and it was really um, pretty amazing. He talked in the chapter that we read about how other people would help take care of his body, and we all took care of each other's souls. And um, I think he had to work through that, um, really strong independence that he had to allow other people to help him. I mean, he was that took a lot in itself. And then over time to see his body deteriorating, because the paralysis got better for a while, but then it kind of went downhill over time. Um, so that he had more discomfort, and his body function kept decreasing over the years. Um, but he hardly ever complained. Really, I mean, just that was astonishing. He never climbed into um, that poor me uh, place in ways that, I mean, I remember having a round of sciatica over the years in between, and being in excruciating pain myself, and saying to, how can I work with this? What can I do to, you know, deal with this? Because I couldn't get my uh, head around it, and I couldn't do what I was talking about before. Get into that witnessing place. The pain was just too fierce. So he was pretty, he helped me get a little bit of an edge on it. Sometimes that's enough. And I took a lot of ibuprofen. um, but you can see when somebody is suffering that way. And he really walked his talk as far as working with that identification with his suffering. And I think those of you who had some sense of his presence. Sorry, that was a phone I forgot to disconnect. But could see that he had really taken that identification not just out of being identified with his body, but to a point where he actually was able to love the uh, everything that was going on, and not just, you know, um, the enjoyable moments of getting in the swimming pool when he could be weightless for a while and just, float in that body, or going in the ocean, which he loved. But, all of the hard places too. Um, and I think that suffering forced him to evolve that way, so that he became more and more loving and less identified with that body until he was finally able to give it up. And I was with him when he died, and it was not, I just, the only time I've actually been with somebody when they left their body, and it was intense. It wasn't like, oh, the last sigh and gone. I think it was a real transition, but his presence stayed around and has stayed around. And my experience with his death and um, some other deaths of those close is that the love does not die. And do one more thing. The sense in this time when so many people are dying, when we've had, probably in excess of 100,000 people in 2 months gone, that sense of this being this cloud of beings who have lost their bodies around us. And some of them are people that we know and love, and that love is still here. And I think we can still maintain that feeling of expansive being, as Ram Dass would call it, staying in our hearts through all this. Thanks.
Sorry for the little pause. To deal with some of the sound issue, I'm waiting for you to mute before I unmute. So there's a little delay. But I really hear that that sense of like challenge and seeing this dear friend of yours in the stroke, and also like this sense of deep inspiration. And it's such a beautiful combination. The next question comes from Mickey, and he writes, "Where's my guru during this darkness? Please tell me it's Grace. Chronically ill, 4 hip replacements, never to dance again, seizures, family abandonment. Where is my guru?"
Here, I don't, the guru is that thing that I don't want to say this in a way that sounds, like glib, like the Ramana Maharshi, God, Guru, and Self are the same. Although that is certainly the case. But I think what Ram Dass is talking about in relation to the stroke is something that we all go through when there is intense suffering that either we have to deal with, and whether it's emotional or psychological or existential or physical. but finding that place of just allowing ourselves to open to our inner being. That's where the guru is. The guru is inside of us. If we, you can use Maharaji as a guru image, if that's helpful. Or I sometimes, excuse me, I sometimes use his name as a mantra. Or I use his mantra was always Ram. He, when I first got to India, I thought I would follow in Ram Dass' footsteps and become a renunciate yogi, as he had first done when he first got there, and he was trained by Haridas. But as it turned out, Haridas had parted company with Maharaji before I got there, unknown to me. And Maharaji said, if you want to do sadhana, if you want to do spiritual work, do Shri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram. Just do the mantra, just do it. And that will take you in. And whatever your particular approach is, whether it's looking into your own eyes in the mirror, or looking at a candle flame, or following your breath, or doing your mantra, just do it. Practice. I mean, it's not called practice for nothing. You got to do it.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question and the answer. I know many of us have had that period in our lives where felt disconnected from grace and often looking for it out there. And so that reminder to like keep practicing that takes you inward and that the grace does come. So this is from Ryan. He asks, how can we relate the Ramayana to current events? Is the awareness behind the mind our shared awareness? Is it what the Bible means by Holy Ghost, or be still and know that I am God?
You mean, is Ravana our president at the moment? It's possible. What was the part about the Holy Ghost? That was interesting.
Let me say that again. So our shared awareness that you were talking about earlier, is this what the Bible means by Holy Ghost, or that phrase, be still and know that I am God?
That would be one way to understand that. That's for sure. And to be still and know that I am God is a pretty direct prescription for going within, however you get there. And the Holy Ghost part, I am not well enough versed in how that triumvirate works, except I think of there's that piece from the Heart Sutra. Not sure which translation this is, but it's the form is the form of the formless. The formless is no other than form. So the formless, which you could think of as Holy Ghost or God or that shared awareness, is always here. It's always part of the form that we're, coming across with, that we're zooming through right at the moment. These dancing electrons are the form and the formless at the same time. This is what, when you start trying to understand this, there is no understanding. There is just being. And we can only let go into that place and allow it to arise within us. It's not, if you can open yourself, however you do that, through meditation or through kirtan or through mantra or by service, by helping other people or feeding people. This is what Maharaji recommended. Ramdas said, okay, so how do I raise my kundalini? And Maharaji said, feed people. And then he talked to us about Christ quite a lot. And we were, I'm from a Jewish background, as we're probably 50% of the stupid white people that came to see him. Foreigners, you have to understand, foreigners are like worse than outcasts in the caste system in India. We're like, not only ignorant fools, but we're impure to boot. So the Indian devotees around Maharaji, because he put up with us, they put up with us. But a lot of scenes around holy people in India are not terribly outgoing toward Westerners. And Maharaji was very tolerant and really took us into that Sabek, all one place, so that the Indian devotees and the Westerners really have become a family in some bizarre way. I mean, we're all Maharaji's family. And in some sense, whether we saw him in the body or we read about him, last week, or somebody has a dream, or somebody sees a film or a picture or whatever it is, it's like an awakened being can awaken other beings. That's what his job is. Pretty good job description. Good work if you can get it. I think I've completely lost track of the point of that question, but it's okay.
Well, let's move on to the next one, which comes from Russell, who says, thanks for reading. I love listening. Can you please talk about becoming free from addiction, free from the struggle of suffering, of becoming content with the one?
Addiction's tough because of the physical dependencies that tie into our unconscious. So it's a lot of work to break through that, I think. I mean, I've only tried a couple of things that felt really addictive, and was not. I don't. That I was very blessed by, like my aunt gave me a pipe for my birthday when I was 15, and I inhaled the pipe tobacco and turned green, and I have always hated the taste of tobacco since. So I've had aversion therapy around addictions, which works, but once you're plugged into it, it's a lot of work to stay with it. But the spiritual part of it, if you can find that place in yourself to see when you are getting pulled in, you can begin to loosen those attachments. I mean, these are all places that we cling in our mind, whether we call it addiction. I mean, addiction to our thoughts, to the thought of that's going to do something for you. I mean, that's a tough one because that's conditioning that you have to break. And that takes some faith that there's a place in you that is not addicted. And we're all, because you have a particular addiction and you identify with that, if you can work on that place where you identify with it, it might help dealing with the physical withdrawal and breaking free of it. I don't know. As I've been working on Ram Dass' memoir and going through the psychedelic period that he went through between Harvard and Millbrook and all of that. He mentioned at one point that Bill, I forget his last name, the guy who started 12 Steps, that his original breakthrough was from taking acid. And these experiences are there that can help you break free. And if we think of it more as a process of awakening out of something, that may be helpful. Don't know.
So was I hearing that acid was the no? I'm just was the way through. I also, again, I keep coming back to this compassion and action bundle of how compassion for ourselves is just such a key part of moving beyond, finding that that force that's bigger than those places that are attached. You're muted, so I didn't quite hear what you said.
I'm not recommending acid as the treatment for addiction, but let me be clear about that.
Just wanted to double check. So Sarah asks, as you witnessed Ram Dass suffering, I can only imagine the suffering that it created in you. And so the question is, how do we provide friendship from a place of compassion rather than trying to eliminate our own suffering?
Well, I think partly is that place of not climbing into somebody else's suffering, of not reinforcing their, if they have feeling of being a victim or how they identify with their suffering. And that is not easy to pull off sometimes, because it can be in the middle of trauma or violence or real serious sickness. In Ram Dass' case, it was something that had occurred over 2 decades, and he was would go in and out of discomfort with it, but mostly he was just hanging out and just being with it. And it was not like he had allowed his suffering to occupy his entire consciousness, which is often what happens to people. So to the extent that we can be with somebody just as a being and not see them as their suffering, And Ram Dass certainly encouraged that because he didn't see it as just his suffering. He was just hanging out. And that quality is helpful to another being. I don't mean, joking and making light of somebody else's suffering, but being able to help them see it as suffering and not necessarily my suffering. The thing about identification, how we identify with our body. And it's a tricky place sometimes. But staying clear yourself is really the best thing that you can do for somebody else.
It reminds me of in your reading about the cleaning lady that would come in and didn't identify with the suffering that was going through, but what was beyond it. Farah writes, what's a valuable lesson you personally learned through your life that you would like to share with us in regards to discipline? Are discipline and routine important to you?
I am what you would call a sloppy bhakti. I'm not terribly disciplined, but I have now sort of set up structures in my life that compel me to practice now and then. For instance, I lead a little meditation circle. Now I'm doing it on Zoom at 7:30 in the morning, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So I got to get up and do it. I'm the one who rings the bell. It's my, it gets me to sit. So you can build in these kind of alarm clocks into your existence, whatever it is. I mean, and routines definitely help that way. Not that I think, as Gurdjieff used to say, you could set alarm clocks for yourself and they would work for a while and then you'd have to figure out a new one because you don't wake up. But, Krishnadas has a great metaphor for practice. His practice is chanting, kirtan. And he said it's like getting on the train. And you get on the train, and he said, I'm running as fast as I can in the opposite direction that the train is going. But the train is still going to its destination. I'm going to get there whether I like it or not. And that is kind of, to me, the way the spiritual path works. Once you have realized that there is another place other than just your physical, material existence, you're cooked. I mean, your goose is cooked. And that doesn't mean that you're enlightened, but it means that no matter how far you go from that awakening, it will still pull you back because that is the most central part of our lives, our consciousness, our awareness. And, in this culture, it's easy to bury it, but it does have a way of waking you back up again, sometimes when you least expect it. So surrendering to the point where you can have a practice is probably useful. and sitting with other people and creating situations where you have some reinforcement, uh, like chanting or meditating together, or however you do it, and setting aside some times in your uh, life. And since most of us are on enforced retreat at the moment, it's not a bad time to set up those routines and um, make yourself do them for a while. But Sydney Mob, I think it was Krishnadas asked her about this at some point, about whether it's you making effort or Maharaji's grace. Whether this is grace or will that takes you into spiritual practice, gets you closer to God. And the curious thing about her answer was that it's both. You got to do what you can, and Maharaji helps you out. And he said that to Ramdas about when Ramdas had this kind of anger fit at one point when we were in India, and he threw a plate of food at somebody. And throwing prasad in front of Maharaji is not exactly. It was pretty extreme. And Maharaji said, after he sat him down in front of him and he gave him warm milk and kind of calmed him down, he said, if you give up your anger, I will help you. The other thing that he said to us about practice is, and this was more about meditation, is bring your mind to one point and wait for grace. And that's that same place of you do your end of it and you'll be helped.
Yeah.
So that's all I understand about practice. I'm not a good practitioner, but it does work on you.
That's great. So, there's an image in my head of a bird with, and one of the wings is grace and the other is practice, like our own will. And it's why we do these live stream events and readings, and it's like that remembering of we have to keep being reminded to go do the thing, to get back to it, because it does feel like it's easy to atrophy and then pull in. And I loved what you said about the train, because often it feels like I have to make it happen. I think many feel like that, like I have to make it happen. And it's like, you're already going, so relax a little bit. Don't need to strive all of the time. So thank you for that. And you have a meditation circle, right, that people can join, and we'll give it.
Yeah. I do it through the local yoga studio in Amagansett on Long Island, where I live. And at this point, we're doing it on Zoom, so other people can get on. And it is mandalayoga.com, MANDALA, yoga.com. I guess I can put that in the chat or something.
Yeah, I'll put that in the follow-up email. And if people want to get that email, sign up for the Ramdas Fellowship. It's ramdas.org/fellowship. I want to be mindful of the time and people's time, but I do want to just have two follow-up questions. The first one is, how do you deal with it? It's a small question. How do you deal with anxiety?
Well, it depends on, I mean, let's be uh, clear that the level of anxiety can be okay. You're worried about something and it's keeping you awake at night, and you need a way to get to sleep or something like that. That's one level of it. There are other levels of anxiety where your mind starts going all the time, and you can't. Um, um, it's changing your heart rate and boosting your blood pressure and causing side effects and ruining your life. And I think I think you have to make judgments about what you need to do to deal with it, whether you need um, psychological or pharmacological help, or whether trying to work with it with your spiritual practice is going to be helpful. It certainly isn't going to hurt it. And again, this time is fraught for all of us. We're dealing with an invisible grim reaper who is walking amongst us, and that is plenty of cause for plenty of anxiety for everybody. So there's that social level of it, and then there's the individual, worrying about whether we're going to be able to pay our bills, or whether we'll ever get back to work again, or um, what the um, consequences of all this will be. I think there are many levels of it, and some of them are thought process, like coming to terms with impermanence, that everything is changing all the time, and even the things that, especially the things we take for granted, I guess, can go away in a heartbeat. Um, but if you can do things that help you to live in the moment, like come into your breath when you start to get anxious, just stay with that rising and falling. Or if you use mantra, or if you go out and go running, there are a lot of different levels of. I like to garden, for instance. I think gardening is probably my form of therapy. Um, but everybody has different ways to connect, and you know whatever you need to do, but to also cut yourself some slack. That everybody is dealing with a certain level of craziness at this juncture, and sometimes we are feeding each other's anxiety, and all the crazy conspiracy nonsense that is flying around, and sometimes we can get free of that and just drop into a deeper place. And I think being able to, the hardest thing is often to love ourselves. That's the tough one. We're the difficult cases right here. And my impression was that Maharaji only took the most difficult cases. So if you're watching this and you've been pulled into Maharaji's orbit in some respect, you're probably half crazy to start with. So don't worry about it. But just staying in our hearts and trying to find that place of love and loving ourselves is, even with all our fears and anxieties and uh, uncertainties at this time.
Thank you for that. I'm glad to know we're all half crazy. So another question from Jeremy, or this is from Mickey, sorry. How do we serve during this pandemic?
Well, the ways that we serve each other by being present and um, finding that place of shared awareness that frees us from the suffering. And then there are the places of physically helping, um, if you can, if you are um, um, able to do things for other people. If there are people helping with the food banks and uh, certainly the medical side of things. If you are, uh, I'm not suggesting anybody endanger their own well-being by doing any of that, but there is a lot to do, and there is a lot to do just in helping people get um, accurate information and setting up. I have one friend out here who is kind of setting up neighborhood networks so that people who are experiencing that kind of anxiety maybe can have someone to talk to. And since we have these ways of communicating that we didn't have in the 1918 flu epidemic, we have some tools, and we all have our personal networks of people that we can help along, whether that is uh, physical or financial or emotional support. It's good to know that that feeling that we're all in it together. I think that just breaking through the isolation that we're all experiencing. I mean, I feel like I'm on retreat, but other people are feeling completely abandoned and alone. It's all, to do with how you are experiencing this. And there are lots of ways to help when you start looking for ways that you can pitch in and be with people. And sometimes just doing your own practice is the best service that you can do.
Yeah. Like I know locally we have some shelters that, and we've been bringing meals and dropping them off. They've set up like safe ways to do it. And there's like buddy systems that have popped up, and um, there's like a national thing of what if we give it away? Like if you get your stimulus check and don't need it, you can give it to other people. So I think there's lots of just researching a little bit too of your local area, what's going on.
And the ashram in Taos is closed. The Tao Hanuman Temple in Taos, and they have had a big garden going for the last few years to provide food at the temple. So they're moving that on to the local food bank.
It's great. It's great. Just there's lots of creativity going on out there with how to connect people. Here's another one from Ian. In these trying and uncertain times, how do we stay informed and push for change without becoming angry?
Well, don't get angry, get organized. Or as other people have said, vote. Change is needed. It's very clear. I mean, I don't know. I have my own view of that, and I'm sure you do too. And you can get into the resistance side of it, or you can get on the helpful side. Um, there is a lot of information out there floating around. Some of it is misinformation. I think that this year, instead of Miss America, we should have a misinformation contest. Uh, anyway, I think that it's important to be engaged now on that level and to understand what is happening. I've been getting a blog from a professor of American history at Boston College who is so on top of what is happening. And she sees it with this kind of historical perspective of what all this means in the context of, our history. And the norms that are being swept aside. And this is a time when truth is really becoming important, and it's kind of an endangered species. So it is important, I think, to, this is just me, but I think it's important to um, stay behind the people and the sources who are putting out reliable information, who are telling the truth and trying to discern. There is that quality of discernment and trying to distinguish between truth and falsehood. And satya, truth, is one of the yamas and niyamas of yoga. So it's good to practice that. But I think, this is not going to be a time to not vote because you think it's all going to happen anyway and you're powerless and all of that. That it is the time to stay plugged in, stay tuned in.
Definitely. Thank you. And locally and nationally, just want to add that part. So thank you so much, Ramesh, for coming on and for reading from this amazing book and for all of your deep wisdom and life history. It really is so meaningful to the folks who are on watching. So many comments about how wonderful this is and how much gratitude they have. So I wanted to pass that on to you. And also, just want to shout out to Mangala and JR who are behind the scenes that really make this happen, as well as Kelly and Rachel. Like, it is a team effort. And for all of the people who show up, clearly we are needing to stay connected. We're needing to stay inspired. We're needing to stay reminded to keep doing these things. So I'm so grateful that we're able to offer these. This live stream is recorded and will be available until the end of the pandemic. You can watch on whichever platform you're on. It also will be on ramdas.org/book reading. And remember that we actually do have a follow-up discussion. So if you found this chapter of this book interesting, which it was so brilliant to me. We're going to be doing a whole book discussion on June 1st. So it gives you time to get the book. There's a discount for people who are fellowship members, which you'd get through the email if you signed up. And then we'll connect on Zoom chat, and we'll go into breakout rooms so we can really dive deep. We'll have some question prompts. So if you want to be a part of that, make sure you sign up. Again, that's ramdas.org/fellowship, where you can find the sign up for that. And as always, it takes a village to make this happen, and keeping this legacy alive. And in order to do that, not only do people show up, but their contributions are really helpful as well. So please, if you're able to during this time, you can go to ramdas.org/support and donate whatever feels right to you. And again, stay tuned, because we have a lot more things coming up, including that Compassion and Action bundle, which is on the Ramdas website, which is just really wonderful and deep. There's a lot of great learnings on there, including the podcast and Be Here Now. So, and do you want to say one more time about your meditation and how people can sign up?
Yeah, can I put it in the chat thing, or how does that work? How did I do that?
No, say it on here, and I will take it and I'll send it out through the email and on those platforms, but no one else will see the chat here. So
About a 45-minute meditation. There's 20 minutes sit, read a little bit, and then another 20 minutes sit. And it's at 7:30 in the morning on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday Eastern time. And the site is mandalayoga.com. It's in this. You have to go to their schedule, and then you can find the link that way. It's amazing that we're all connecting on Zoom. I'm really enjoying that, and this was really fun to do. Thank you, Jackie, and Willa and JR. You really made it work. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. And also remember that there are lots and lots of local fellowships around the world. So if you want to have local connections, you can find, as I said, many of them are doing them virtually right now in this time. And then just think about when you finally get to come back together with these people you've had these online connections with. So you can connect with me at info@ramdas.org to get connected, or you can find it on our Facebook page. It's a little bit complex on how to get there, but it's under the photo albums. Then you'll find your area and you can find your people there. So anyway, thank you all so much for being a part of this. Please be a part of the book discussion group. And we have another live stream coming up in early June with Mirabai Bush. It'll be more of a teaching, and then we'll have another reading later next month as well. So be well, stay connected, keep doing your practices. Ram Ram.